Okay, let's talk a little bit about sewing terminology. There are some basic terms that you should know as someone who sews, especially if you're going to be talking with other people who sew or in Facebook groups, just so you can ask questions and communicate clearly with people who sew. It's good to know some basic terminologies. So these are going to be terms for sewing in general. You can find more specific terms for certain types of sewing, like garment sewing or bag making, in some of my other courses that will be geared towards those specific categories. But these are just kind of some general sewing terms. So we talked about finding the backstitch button or reverse button. So you're going to need to know backstitch. Backstitch is the process of sewing backwards over loose threads at the start or end of a stitch, and it secures your stitch. Okay, you also do that if a thread is broken and you're restarting a stitch, you will backstitch. A seam is the line where two pieces of fabric are sewn together. So you can see there's two pieces of fabric sewn together here, and this has created a seam. The seam allowance is the space between the fabric edge and the seam. So this will be different for different patterns, different projects, and you should find the seam allowance in each pattern you purchase. So they might say with a seam allowance of 3/4 inch, in which case you would sew your line, your seam, 3/4 of an inch from the edge. So that is your seam allowance. Another thing you will need to know is the hem. The hem is the edge of the fabric that's been folded and sewn under in order to keep the raw edge from unraveling and being seen. So the hem is folded under so you don't see it. Okay? Then basting. To baste, you can sew by hand or machine with long stitches. So basting is long stitches, and it's used to temporarily hold two pieces of fabric together, and then so that they stay in place, and then you can easily remove it. So you see this bottom stitch line here has more shorter basic stitches. This top line of stitching is a basting stitch. They're very long, so you can easily rip those stitches out a lot easier than this. So basting stitch is a long stitch length. And then binding. Binding is using a thin strip of fabric or bias tape in order to hide the edge of a piece of fabric. So you'll basically fold a piece of binding over the top and bottom just to hide the edge of that fabric. Seam ripper, we talked about earlier, is a small tool with a pointed edge used to remove stitches from a piece of fabric. And then a sewing notion is a general term for an item that is sewn or attached to a sewing project, such as a button or a snap, but it can also be used to describe a tool for sewing, like a pin or a seam ripper. So you will see sewing notion used in those two ways. Zigzag stitch is a stretchable sewing machine stitch that runs diagonally back and forth in a zigzag pattern. When talking about fabric, there's a few things you'll have to know. You'll have to know the fabric grain. Now, that's the orientation of the fibers, either woven or knit together to create fabric, and the grain creates lines that run parallel and perpendicular. So you can see the grain of the fabric lengthwise going here and crosswise going over here. This is the grain of the fabric. Typically you talk about following the grain of the fabric going vertically here, parallel to the selvage edge. The bias is diagonally across the grain of fabric, and this is where there's a little bit more stretch or give, especially on a woven fabric. Then the selvage edge is the edge of a raw fabric that runs along the edge of the grain with the grain, kind of like I told you, it's parallel to the grain, and it doesn't fray. This is how it is when it's sold. You'll see this special selvage edge and it won't fray because they've put it on the roll of fabric that way. And then the raw edge is the cut edge. So the raw edge is the unfinished or cut edge. So it runs perpendicular to the selvage edge. You also have the right side and the wrong side of fabric. The right side is referred to the best or prettiest side of the fabric, where the colors are the brightest and you see the pattern printed out. It's the clearest top part of the fabric. The wrong side is the back of the fabric. The colors are usually more muted. It's the less desirable or ugly side of the fabric. So the right and the wrong side of the fabric. Another term you'll need to know is top stitching, and that is sewing along the top of a project. Usually it's a slightly longer stitch, and it's along the top edge just to finish a project off. So top stitching is another term you'll need to know. Now again, those are just some of the basic terms. There are plenty of other ones, but there's no reason to be overwhelmed with them in the beginning. Just learn those basic terms first, and then move on from there as you get more advanced. Okay? Alright, I'll see you in the next lesson.